Good afternoon and welcome to the 2020-2021 academic year at Sciences Po School of Management and Innovation. I'm Natacha Valla, the Dean of the school, and I'm joined today for the lecture by Olivier Guillet, who is sitting there and who is the Executive Director of our school. We have a speaker whom we love to have today, but before introducing him, I would like to say a few words about the particular context in which we've started the year this time. We've seen this week students arriving on campus for the Rentrée. It was very nice to hear their voices, to see the movements around. We know, however, that in a few days, in fact, most of the teaching will take place online. We know it can be challenging to some of you, but be assured that our teams are mobilized to make sure that this experience is unfolding in the best way. It is a privilege for me to be arriving at the school. I joined it at the beginning of the month. It's a young school, but with a very well-established reputation. And I will have at heart to protect its founding values and make sure that we remain at the same time on top of all the challenges that we face today and that we will face tomorrow. This will be done thanks to the pluridisciplinarity that we benefit from in the unique place, which is Sciences Po. Before presenting our speaker, I'll take a few minutes to tell you a little bit what my view is of the raison d'être of the school this year in 2020 and for the years to come. And I think this raison d'être lies at the nexus of two critical issues. The first issue, and I'm an economist, so you won't be surprised about the tone and rhetorics that I will use, but has to do with the nature and the pace of growth that's going to come in the years to come. We've witnessed a slowdown, and some of us believe that this slowdown will be only temporary due to a phenomenon that is dubbed as secular stagnation. Others might think that this is something that will last for longer, that can be due to a sort of historical process whereby waves of innovations creates waves of growth, but also intermediately waves of slow economic and social development. So we don't know, but what we want to make sure of is that the students today are equipped with the tools to understand what's going on, to understand this general context where with this slow growth, we also have had a sequence of crises, and those crises have had multiple natures, economic dimension, a financial dimension, but also a social, political, and obviously also ecological dimension. So this is the first set of issues that I see at the center of our raison d'être. The second one is really how this overarching environment is spilling on to the firm, to institutions. How are they affected and how should they react? How are they affected in day-to-day business, in the resilience of their business model? But also, how can they be led to respond to those huge externalities that we are facing right now? We have seen a huge response on the part of public policies, but private firms also have their place, their role to play. What is the role of digital transformation, and what are the implications of digital transformation for the firm and for this environment? So where does this leave us? We know that we have those challenges at the individual level, institutional level, and collective level. And what we know collectively is that we've witnessed a number of market inefficiencies. We don't live in a world where markets are efficient, where prices give you the full information. The world is full of coordination issues. So we have to move beyond some of the paradigms that have been developed, such as the shareholder value to define the raison d'être of the firm, to fully grasp their contribution to what I would call the intertemporal social welfare. So what does that mean concretely for our students here at Sciences Po School of Management and Innovation? First, they should care and they should be exposed to thinking about governance issues. That's one key topic for us. They should be thinking about innovation and creativity as a way to get over those difficulties that we're facing. And last but not least, I mentioned it already, data and digital should be at the core of their curriculum. So welcome to the school again. I think the school can be proud of what has been achieved already, but we cannot rest on our laurier, as we say in France. We really need to live up to our reputation of excellence and open-mindedness. There's no place to be parochial. Having said this, I would like to introduce our speaker, whose name is Jason Furman. So you will see him in a few minutes. Jason is incontournable as an economist in the United States, and he's also very famous in Europe. He's currently professor of the practice of economic policy, jointly at Harvard Kennedy School and at the Department of Economics at Harvard. Any student who is there will have faced Jason's lectures when he or she graduates. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute in Washington. This comes after numerous years as top economic advisor to President Obama. Jason has been the 28th chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors between 2013 and 2017. Mind you, those were the years of, crisis management. So this is really our topic. And I think he embodies the values that we want to bring forward in the school. His biography is much longer, but let me give him the floor. And after his lecture, Olivier will take over and will moderate the questions that you will be able to provide through the messaging. Enjoy the lecture.
So do you hear me?
We hear you very well.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to this academic year for Sciences Po School of Management and Innovation. In many ways, it's going to be a very different year than any of us have ever had before. I certainly am having that with my own students teaching online. There's some things that's harder to do, but there's also some new opportunities that this form of learning is at School of Management and Innovation as your dean. She's someone who's equally comfortable in academia, in public policy, and in the world of business, bringing her insights from one area to others. And I think we'll be drawing on all of that with her just incredibly energetic and innovative leadership of your school. So I was very honored to be included as a speaker today. Want to step back and start by talking actually about the history of economic thought and what it tells us about the role of a market economy, the role of businesses, the role of government. After that, I'll talk about what I see as the structural challenges of the world's economies. And then finally, want to look to the future and the role that government, the role that business, the role that others can play in changing it. But I want to, certainly in the United States, and I know it's caused protest, discussion, reflection around the world with the issue of racial justice, the issues that go under the headings of racism, systematic racism, racial disparities, racial discrimination. That has been an issue since the founding of the United States, a country that had slavery for over 200 years. It's an issue in the United States today. It's an issue in Europe today. It's an issue around the world today. I wanted to say in that respect is that I was researching and learning more about the tradition of being anti-slavery and of being anti-racist. capitalist. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, one of the founders of modern economics, made the argument that slavery was not just immoral, and he used the word evil, but that also it was inefficient, that it was a bad way to organize your economy, that it didn't lead to innovation, that it didn't lead to growth, and instead talked about the role that markets century historian Thomas Carlyle dubbed economics the dismal science. Thomas Carlyle, more famous for his study of the French Revolution, in which he argued that it was a terrible radical thing that had undermined a more settled and placid order. A lot of people, though, don't quite know why economics was branded the dismal science by Thomas Carlyle. He wrote about it first and called it the dismal science in the year 1849 in an essay he wrote arguing for the reintroduction of slavery in the British Caribbean. Slavery had been outlawed by Britain in 1834, and 15 years later, Thomas Carlyle, a historian, said slavery is the natural order. The different races are different. Some races should be subjugated, other races should be their masters. And then he complained that the obstacle to reintroducing slavery were the economists. And the economists had this dismal notion that people were equal, that people should engage on a voluntary basis, not through force, that markets should be how production is determined rather than slavery and force. And Thomas Carlyle thought this idea that this entire discipline of economics was against slavery made it a dismal discipline. You couldn't have the happiness he thought would result from the reintroduction of slavery. Let's fast forward now an entire century to the 1950s, when economics was being turned not from the type of words and philosophy that Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill phrased their learning in, but into a more precise and mathematical discipline, one that stated its assumptions clearly and derived its conclusions mathematically in the form of theorems and proofs. In the 1950s, Canaro and Gerard Debreu established two theorems called the first and second fundamental theorems of welfare economics, where they basically formalized Adam Smith's idea and showed that if we were all selfish, we all interacted entirely through markets, everything was just determined by the price system, that the resulting allocation would be efficient. They showed, in other words, on a certain sense, that markets were good and that markets worked. What was really important, though, about Arrow and Debreu was they didn't just show that markets worked, it was a precise mathematical proof. And in the course of that mathematical proof, they listed all of the assumptions you needed to reach that conclusion. Those assumptions included that there were markets for everything, that everyone had perfect information, that everyone could see and buy and sell things into the future, that there were no monopolies, that people behaved rationally. And even with all of that, that the initial allocation was of resources and wealth was one that was fair. So you can look at that research by Arrow and Debreu and say they proved that markets are wonderful and worked. Or you could look at their research and say they proved that under only the most highly unrealistic assumptions about perfect information, no monopolies, perfect markets, etc., that markets worked. And so in effect, they proved that in the real world, many of those things are lacking. And so markets are going to have challenges and problems. And I like to look at that research by Arrow and Debreu and look at it both ways. It shows without a central planner, if you want to make a can of soup, we can make a can of soup by distributing the labor of millions of people around the world who make the inputs into that can, the metals, the ink, the food that goes into it, the distribution systems, the trucks it goes on, the supermarkets it's sold to. That's millions of people all working together cooperatively without any person in charge of all of them, almost miraculously, just through price signals, doing what they need to get that can of soup to you. But then that same Arrow and Debreu result shows that if we all do whatever it is that we think is best, we won't take into account the cost it has in terms of carbon. That will lead to climate change. That a monopoly might form and it'll raise prices too high, hurting consumers, or get in the way of information. That will have asymmetric information. And so in a place like the United States, a health insurance company before the reforms we did a decade ago wouldn't sign you up for healthcare if it was afraid that you had asthma or some other pre-existing condition that would cost it too much money. Or even that based on the initial allocation of wealth, that whole wonderful market works, but it doesn't work for the people who are the worst off and have been the most left out. And so since the 1950s, economics, by its precise assumptions, has been able to explain to us sort of miracle of innovation, of decentralized coordination through an arm's length price system, but has also been able to show us and be very precise about the ways in which that doesn't work and the ways in which that is limited. So that brings us to today. And today, that's still the challenge that we're wrestling with. Many ways a market economy can deliver innovation. It can send those of you that will go off after Sciences Po to work in the business world, that even if all you're looking at is profit, you'll serve that goal better by creating new and innovative goods that consumers want. And that will help raise wages, that will help lower prices, and that will help improve living standards. And I think that's a wonderful thing to be engaged in. But it also shows that if that's the only thing that everyone does, we'll have the types of problems that threaten the future of our planet, that threaten our societies, that have helped undermine them politically, leading to the rise of populism in some countries successfully. In other countries, populism has gotten a lot of votes, like in France, but ultimately has, at least so far, been unsuccessful. And with that, they threaten to unleash political forces that will undermine the very market economy that so many of us believe in and want to work in. That is sort of quick summary of the history of a certain strain of economic thought, a thought in which markets are important, but markets have their limits, that also has at its bedrock not force, not control, but inclusivity and everyone contributing to the economy. Want to now turn to what I see as the fundamental structural challenge that all of our economies faced. We're all in the midst of an economic crisis right now, and I'll have a few words to say about that. But even before that economic crisis, in most of the advanced economies, income growth over the last couple decades, since around 1980, has been a lot slower for the typical household than it was in the years roughly 1950 to 1980. You had in France, it's called the Three Glorious Decades. I won't try to botch my French pronunciation for all of you. In the United States, some have called it a golden age. And it was a period after World War II when basically every generation saw its income double from the previous generation, when almost every child grew up to be materially better off than their parents were. And it was fueled by a few things. One thing it was fueled by was productivity growth and innovation was unusually large. In fact, the highest it's ever been for the frontier economies in the world over that period of time. Partly that was recovery from the destruction in World War II, especially in countries like Germany and France that were rebuilding their capital stocks that had been devastated by the war. Partly it was based on large-scale public investment. There was huge public investment that went into developing products for World War II that then got commercialized and civilianized over the following decades. Things like the jet engine or materials like nylon. Partly, it actually was going back to the theme I started with, a paper in one of the top economics journals called Econometrica by economists at Chicago and Stanford that was published last year, found that a substantial portion of the public of innovation in the United States over that period was what they called a reduction in the misallocation of talent. That in 1950, there were very few doctors who were women. There were very few doctors who were Black. By 1980, there were a lot of women doctors, a lot of Black doctors. In 1950, the talent or skill to be a doctor was equally distributed across men and women. The talent to be a doctor was equally distributed across Black and white. The fact that almost all doctors in 1950 were white men meant we were excluding some of the most talented doctors. We were limiting our search to doctors to 40% of the population instead of 100%. By opening it up, by desegregating, by reducing gender discrimination, it brought more talented people into the economy, and they actually fueled innovation and productivity growth. Immigration also has an incredibly special role in innovation and productivity growth. If you look at the largest corporations in the United States, a large fraction of them were founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. We wouldn't have, without immigration, Apple, Google, Amazon wouldn't be companies that we would have founded in the United States. So the inclusion of immigrants has also historically played an incredibly important role. That was the first factor in the 30 glorious years, or whatever you want to call them, was innovation and productivity growth, fueled in part by the private sector, but in part by public investments, and in part by greater inclusion in the economy, whether of women, minorities, or immigrants. The second factor was that, broadly speaking, that growth was shared. In the United States and most other countries, inequality was either flat or decreasing from 1950 to 1980. So not only did you have a rapidly growing pie, but you also had that pie being shared more evenly. The third ingredient over that period of time was that there was an increased participation in the workforce, especially by women increasingly joining the workforce and contributing to the economy. And in fact, in the second half of the 20th centuries, one of the largest contributions to economic growth was literally going from an economy where women, for the most part, didn't work, to economies where, for the most part, women did. All of this, in some sense, came to an end around 1980 or 1990. Since then, we've seen slower productivity growth. In part, there's been a reduction in public investment in areas like infrastructure and research and development. In part, some of that low-hanging fruit can't ever be reproduced, moving from highly segregated economies on gender or race lines to inclusive economies. There's a lot more progress we need to make, but the remaining problems are probably smaller than the ones we had in 1950. So the gains from solving them are still there, but not as large as they were. In part, we might just have gotten lucky. In part, it was pent-up growth from the Great Depression and World War II. So for a number of reasons, productivity growth has been slower across all of the advanced economies since 1980. At the same time, inequality has risen as growth has become less inclusive. And the gains are growing more slowly, and the gains are being increasingly disproportionately captured by households at the very top. And finally, that influx of people into the workforce has basically come to an end. It's leveled off. And in many places and for many groups, you've even seen some withdrawal from the workforce, some reduction in participation and in employment rates. All three of those factors, a slowing of innovation, an increase in inequality, and a reduction in participation in the workforce, have combined together to make it so that instead of the median household seeing its income double roughly once a generation, it's now the case that incomes double roughly once a century. And where it used to be not guaranteed, it used to be virtually guaranteed that a child would be better off than their parents, now that's not necessarily true, and you can't count on it being true. This is the structural problem we've faced for many decades. And then layered on top of it, we have the fact that once a decade, we have a once-in-a-century crisis. We had a once-in-a-century crisis with the financial crisis and the damage that did to economies that we weren't even all the way towards recovering from when the COVID crisis hit. In some ways, I think we're actually getting better at managing crises. The COVID crisis is a tragedy. It's something that's affected so many of us in so many different ways. It's also the biggest and worst thing to happen to our economy in nearly a century. But This time we responded in force. Countries around the world spent 10% of GDP or more in fiscal measures responding to it. We gave money to workers who weren't able to work. We gave money or lent money to businesses. We spent money on the health response. We made direct cash payments. We cut interest rates. We expanded the balance sheets of central banks. We set up new emergency programs. And with all of that, we've actually had a faster economic recovery than we had from the financial crisis a decade ago or the world depression that we had in the 1930s. So in some ways, I think we actually have learned some of the lessons that we've wanted to learn, that public policy plays a really important role in stabilizing the economy, that it's better to do more than less, and it's better to stay ahead of the issue. We still have very high unemployment. We're still not recovered to where we were before it. We still have a lot of virus out there. We won't be able to solve this problem until health solves it, most likely through a vaccine. Economic policy can't make up for the lack of a vaccine, but it can reduce some of the damage and speed the recovery that comes out of it. And I'm more optimistic today than I was 6 months ago that economic policy is going to succeed in doing that, in part because economic policy has been more vigorous and more ambitious than it was in the financial crisis. You see that in Europe with the fiscal response at the European level, something you didn't have, for example, in the last crisis. And you can argue whether it's too much or too little. You can look at the United States and argue that we got off to a good start, but now have messed up by allowing the aid to lapse, and the president and Congress can't get together to agree on it. You can look at countries around the world and have all sorts of quibbles and all sorts of qualms. But I think our economies are going to be better recovered from this 1 or 2 years from now than I would have thought, better recovered than they would have been without the response, and better recovered than they were from previous crises. Even with that, though, we're going to need to build a better future. Part of that better future is going to have to be more innovation. The innovation can come in the future from the same sources it came in the past. Businesses are central to that. A market economy is central to that. But you need people to do the innovation. So you need education systems and to invest in them. You need talented people. People talk about the race between AI, China, and the United States. Which country will win? Which country will become the world power in artificial intelligence? To some degree, I think that is a misplaced comparison. If China innovates more in AI, we can learn from their innovations, adopt them, and it'll probably make us better off, not worse off. Innovation is positive sum, and it spills over. It's not zero sum. But if I did have to bet who's going to be more successful on AI, I would bet on the United States over China, for the simple reason that China has 1.4 billion people to draw on in developing AI. The United States has nearly 8 billion people to draw on. That's because China is not a country that is particularly open to immigration. The United States, it has its problems. At times, it's less open than it should be. It has certainly its controversies, but broadly speaking, can draw more on the talents of 8 billion people to develop artificial intelligence. And if you look at the top scientists working in American universities, American companies, most of them are foreign born. So immigration, inclusion of groups that are marginalized, that aren't fully included. We're better about it today than we were in 1950, but there's still a lot of work to be done, and public investment. All of that is needed to speed up growth. We also need to make sure that growth is inclusive and sustainable, whether that's by making sure that your fiscal system is taxing appropriately, providing benefits appropriately, that you're dealing with the market distribution of wages, whether by addressing monopoly power of businesses, ensuring workers have power, ensuring there's sufficient institutions like minimum wage to make sure people are paid a decent amount. You need to make sure that that growth is sustainable, climate change being one of the biggest challenges we face. The voluntary actions of companies can play an important role in combating climate change, but ultimately putting a price on carbon, as to some degree you have in Europe, although with imperfect coverage and in most countries too low a price, something you don't have at the national level in the United States. That's a wonderful way to say, let's take billions of people and tell each of them to go out and figure out an invention for how to reduce carbon use for others that they can sell, or to reduce it for themselves. And you're going to get a cash prize in the form of lower carbon tax payments or higher sales for your products if you're able to do that. And finally, an economy where people can really work and participate in the economy if they want to, with workplaces that are flexible and accommodative, with systems like childcare to enable people to work, with apprenticeships, training, other things to connect people to jobs. Nothing about that is automatic. Market economies don't fully solve the problem of employment by themselves without a set of public infrastructure and connective tissue. I don't know what the future of productivity growth is going to be. There's some reasons to be optimistic about artificial intelligence and machine learning, about personalized medicine, about advanced materials, and the like. There's some reasons to be pessimistic that the low-hanging fruit of innovation has already been reaped and harvested, and that even with all of these tremendous technologies, it's going to be that much harder to make progress in the future. So I don't quite know, how to bet on what Natacha called secular stagnation at the beginning, but I know no matter what it is, it's really important that we do more to help the economy grow. We do more to connect people to that growth, that businesses have a vital role, but public policy also has a vital role. And that doing this is really important, not just for the well-being of all of us in our societies, but for the health and sanity of our politics, something that's faced increasing challenges with solutions that to some degree correctly identify a problem of an economic challenge, but then offer snake oil and quick solutions to problems that don't have one simple answer, but problems that we really can make progress on and help to solve if we do it in the right way. So want to conclude by saying, congratulations on joining such an excellent university. I wish you the best in your studies this year. And I think you can all play a big role, whether in the private sector or the public sector. And in either one, you need to respect the other to solve some of our big structural economic challenges, drawing both on all that's great about markets and decentralized choices, but also understanding the limits that they have. So thank you, and I think there's time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Jason, for this mind-provoking, comprehensive, and refreshing talk. Before we move to the questions that our students may have, maybe Natacha has a question for you. And again, thank you very much for this talk. You made a very strong statement for inclusion being not only a driver, but also a condition for a thriving economy. So we're already having quite a few questions from our students, but maybe Natacha has a question for you.
Thank you. I don't want to crowd out the time for students, but just you mentioned one thing in the middle of your talk, which is the voluntary action of the private sector. And we have lots of discussions on this side of the Atlantic as to whether this can really come voluntarily or whether you need the coercion of legal, sort of impetus to make sure that everybody behaves in a way that takes into account those externalities. But I suggest we take a couple of other questions already so that you can interact with students.
Great. I'll just say very quickly, I think that for me, the biggest question is when a company does something voluntarily, is it a substitute or a complement for public action? If you're an oil company or a coal company, and you say, we're going to plant 3 trees, and because we planted 3 trees, the government doesn't need to be involved because we have it under control, that's a problem. Then the voluntary action is an attempt to stop public action. On the other hand, if you have what I think we actually have in climate, which is companies saying, we're going to review our own practices and make sure we're emitting less carbon, and we'd love to see our countries join the Paris Agreement. We'd love to see our countries set targets. And we're supportive of public policies to deal with carbon, and those will complement ours. Then I think that private action is very good, very important, and very welcome. And so you just have to look carefully about whether it's a substitute or a complement for public action, a complement being good, a substitute being potentially bad.
So we have quite a few questions, as I said before. We have one first question that says, how can we as students use economic theory to envision the world as a society more inclusive and more positive?
Yeah, that's, I think, in some ways the most important question that one can ask. And to some degree, I tried to address it in my talk, but it's really important that economics, to understand, it's not just about markets and it's not just about growth. It's always been, since Adam Smith, also about inclusion, also about how to bring the best out of as many people as possible. And so, innovation and growth is an important part of it. If a country is twice as rich, most people in the country will probably be twice as rich. But it's not enough. You have to look at where the growth is going, who's getting the growth, and what you can do to make sure more people are included. And it can be done the right way, a virtuous circle, with the inclusion helping the growth and the growth helping the inclusion, and all of that helping our politics. So in some senses, you have to ask that question over and over again in whatever sphere you're working in.
Thank you, Jason. We have quite a few questions about inflation. I have one. What are the sources of inflation? What are the principle and motivation underlying monetary and fiscal policy?
So in the last 6 months, I've heard a lot of people worried about inflation again. Central banks are, in the common parlance, printing lots of money. What they're actually doing is expanding their balance sheet. They're effectively lending money and borrowing money at the same time. And so central banks have greatly expanded their balance sheets. The money supply has gone up. Interest rates are basically around 0 in all the advanced economies and lower than they were in all the almost all the emerging economies. And so this has led a lot of people to be worried about inflation. Won't this mean inflation? Isn't inflation terrible? Well, first of all, I think it probably won't mean inflation. We have high unemployment everywhere. It's very hard to get pay raises and wages to go up when unemployment is high. Very hard to get inflation without a wage price spiral. And it's very hard for people to want to buy a lot of stuff when many people still have lower incomes and are worried about their jobs. And so in a weak economy, I think it's hard to have inflation. The economy is different enough right now that while my prediction is that inflation will be low, even with all this money, even with the low interest rates and all of that, I predict low inflation. I might be wrong. And we might end up with high inflation. If I'm wrong and we have high inflation, that would be good news, not bad news. It would be good news because it would help speed adjustment in our economies by reducing inflation-adjusted wages and helping employment, by reducing inflation-adjusted interest rates or real interest rates, helping households borrow to buy a home or businesses borrow for plant and equipment. And it would help with deleveraging. It would reduce the burden of debt. So I think inflation is unlikely because we have a weak economy. And until we have a strong economy, I'm not worried about it. And if it does happen, I think it would actually help speed the economic adjustment and be a good sign.
Thank you, Jason. We have another question of a student thanking you for your insightful talk and saying that you mentioned that you're betting on a society of inclusion and openness. But then how do you see the rise of nationalism and populism around the world? And what kind of impacts will it cause to the recovery of our economies?
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic, but also terrified. And, to me, what's ultimately right, I just believe will ultimately win out. And I may be being irrational and not hard-headed in having that conclusion. And I'm happy to admit that there may be some wishful thinking there. Because yes, there are some very powerful currents. And, I spent a bunch of time in my talk on immigration because I think that is probably the single most important lever that countries have, that if they move it in the wrong direction, they'll lower economic growth. And if they move it in the right direction, they'll raise economic growth. I've quantified in the context of the United States how much extra growth we could get through tax reform, how much extra growth we could get through regulatory reform, how much extra growth we could get through education. All three of those add less to economic growth than immigration reform and doing immigration reform right. Should say with immigration, it's not just about the types of people that I suspect are in this virtual room together who are highly skilled. In many cases, many of you probably will work across borders and in different countries. Immigration is also about people who are less skilled. In many cases, they can better themselves enormously. They're more productive in France as a low-skilled worker than they would have been in Morocco as a low-skilled worker. Moreover, if they're going to be in France, it's better to have them protected by French labor laws and working above the table and legally than working under the table where they could effectively unfairly compete. And so I think it's win-win to bring in high-skilled people, but also people with less skills, and to do that in a way that protects them. Now, I recognize that not everyone feels this way, and immigration is probably the single most controversial issue in our societies. It's probably the single largest driver of populism. And so to me, it's the fulcrum debate of, do we want a more inclusive society that ultimately will be more prosperity and more growth for all of us? Or do we want to react to the slowing of growth by cutting off the engine that actually is helping the problem and not hurting the problem? And that's difficult. And yeah, I'm not 100% sure we'll get it right, but I really, really hope we do. And I think we will.
Thank you, Jason. I have a question specifically on the United States. Do you think that the United States can sustain a high level of capital and income inequality much longer?
In some sense, I think the answer might unfortunately be yes. We've had a high level of inequality for a while now. It's not like everyone always wants to raise taxes on high income and reduce it. but I think it's contributed to our political problems. It's contributed to undermining some of the foundations of things like immigration that I was talking about. So I think there's powerful forces going in both directions. But if you look at the data, people aren't more concerned about inequality today than they were 30 years ago, even though inequality is a much bigger problem today than it was 30 years ago. So I think I'd like to say it was unsustainable. I hope it's unsustainable. There is a chance, though, it could be sustained.
Thank you, Jason. Another question. In your opinion, how will sovereign states seek to reduce their debt as a result of the massive efforts that have been made to respond to the crisis?
So Natacha invited me to give a talk on the topic of debt, about 5 years ago in New York, called The New View of Fiscal Policy. You can find that talk on the internet too. I won't reproduce all of it here, except to say that I'm a little bit less worried about debt than some are. The right way to look at it is not how much is your debt relative to your economy, but how much are your interest payments relative to your economy? And debt levels right now are very high, but interest rates are very low, and those move in opposite directions. I think if we move too rapidly to reduce our debt, that would put downward pressure on interest rates and make it even harder to do monetary policy. So, I think there's fiscal adjustments that need to be made across most countries. But I think, one, we definitely don't need to worry about those fiscal adjustments now. Right now, we should be worried about getting our economies back on their feet and growing again. But then even after we do that, I think we can do those adjustments gradually. I don't think they're a huge crisis right now. I think capital markets are telling us something by their willingness to lend at such low interest rates. Even Italy can borrow at low interest rates, in part because of the perception that Europe stands behind that debt. And so I think this is one of the challenges we face. I don't think it's the number one biggest challenge or the number one most urgent challenge. I think we can afford a gradual solution to it.
Thanks very much, Jason. Well, needless to say that all of our students are thanking you prior to asking the question. So this student is also thanking you for this very important talk of yours. You mentioned a few times climate change and the environment. We can see how many companies seem reluctant to changing their models and practices. What would be your point of view on this and your advice to reach a sustainable economy?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of energy companies that use a cost of carbon in making their decisions. If they're deciding whether to build a new coal-fired power plant, they say, how much will it cost to build the plant? How much will it cost to operate the plant? And let's add in $25, $50, 25, 50 euros, a ton of carbon, and add that to the cost side of the ledger. They're doing that because when you build a coal-based power plant, you're building something that's going to be around for 50 years. And it has to not just work today, it has to work 20 years from now. And they expect that 20 years from now, we're going to have a carbon tax or cap and trade or more regulations or something like that. And so I think the first part of your answer is, at least for any decisions that are very long-term a company makes, a lot of them already are taking climate change into account, and they're taking it into account because they expect there to be future action, or because they're an insurance company and they're worried about increased damages in the future. Basically because they have to for economic reasons. That, of course, isn't enough, and that doesn't work nearly as well when you're making a decision that's just about whether to do extra flight this year or change your light bulbs this year, which are decisions that are on a much shorter time horizon than a 50-year building a plant that's meant to last for 50 years. And so I think the expectation of public action can lead to private action. Conversely, the more private action there is, the cheaper that makes it to undertake public action, and the easier it makes it to undertake public action. So I think there's a real complementarity here. I've been, broadly speaking, impressed with the way the business community has handled the issue of climate change. I think that a lot of places really are taking it quite seriously, and the institutions that are behind are governments, not businesses. But certainly, a lot more businesses could stand to do more as well.
Thanks very much, Jason. We also have quite a few questions about unemployment and more specifically about the drivers of unemployment. What do you think are the main drivers of unemployment in the growing economies?
Wow. I feel like we could do a whole macroeconomics class together today. I wish we had a semester together instead of the 45 minutes or whatever it is that we actually have. So unemployment, broadly speaking, would divide it into cyclical and structural. Cyclical is what we have right now because our economies have been in recession, because we've had a huge temporary shock to our economies. Cyclical unemployment can be treated by the government spending more, the government cutting taxes, or central banks cutting interest rates or expanding their balance sheets. And I think that cyclical unemployment will go away. The structural unemployment is the more difficult one. That is what was there before the crisis. That's what will be there after the crisis goes away. And structural unemployment has many causes. In some cases, like the United States, I think the biggest issue is that we don't have great training programs. We don't have great apprenticeship programs. We don't have childcare and the like. I think in some countries, it may be because the minimum wage is too high. I don't think that's a problem in the United States. It may be a problem somewhere else. It may be because, unions create problems in some places, or unions don't, exist enough to solve problems in other places. So the structural doesn't have one cause and it doesn't have one remedy. So it's the harder source of unemployment to deal with. The easier one, the one that there's a common remedy for that works in every country, is cyclical unemployment. And that's to have more expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. And that's why I'm so in favor of that medicine. It just isn't going to be enough, but the diagnosis will be very different country to country for other sources.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. Unfortunately, I think it's going to be the time for us to conclude this talk. Thank you so much, Jason, for speaking with us today. Many of our students really are really grateful for the talk you gave. Thank you very much to all of our partners and every one of you who followed our presentation today. Again, thank you and welcome to our students at the School of Management and Innovation. This is going to be for sure a challenging year, but this is going to be also for sure a very exciting and enriching year. Thank you again, Jason. Thank you, Natacha, and the team with us, and have all a very good day. Thank you.